Hey, I think I'm hearing that the waiting room, we're still letting a few people in, but at least the rate of admittance is starting to slop. So I'm going to mute everyone, except hopefully for Vicki. Or I'm going to unmute Vicki. That was, oh shoot.
Unmute myself.
There. Yeah, you can. Thank you. And then, and have a short introduction. So my name is Jeff Linderoth. I'm the current department chair of industrial and systems engineering. Vicki's home for the last going on 30 years or so. She joined the department of industrial and systems engineering and nuclear engineering and engineering physics as an assistant professor in 1989. Was promoted to associate professor in 1995 and full professor in 2001, a meteoric rise through the ranks. In 1996, she helped to found the Center for Human Performance and Risk Analysis and has served as its director since its inception. Its exceptional career since its inception. Professor Bier served as chairperson of the department from 2011 through 2016. And during her tenure here at UW-Madison, she has advised 21 PhD students who have gone on, many of who are here, and have gone on to successful careers in academia, government organizations, and the private sector. As she'll tell us about today, Professor Bier, throughout her career, has applied her technical expertise in risk and decision analysis to very societally important problems. She remains an active researcher, like we say, in flunking retirement, with many new and exciting projects that she's also going to tell us about today. So I won't take any more of Vicki's valuable time, and I'll turn it over to Vicki to tell us about a wonderful career of risk and uncertainty.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jeff. Hello to everybody who's joined. And I know some people, it's very late at night, so you can also, I think, tune in and watch the recording later. I'm going to turn off my video while I present because my internet seems to survive better that way. Hopefully we'll get through this with no glitches. So I wanted to start by two interesting that happened to me yesterday. First of all, I got the official notice that I'm a Professor Emerita from the university. So this is the first day I get to use that title. The other thing that happened to me yesterday, I'm applying for a part-time advisory position that requires me to present my GPAs from my undergraduate and graduate career. So I'm in the process of requesting my transcripts from many, a little bit surreal. But so I will start off with just how I got to where I am, what my background is, and how I ended up in this field. So, and I have to figure out how to advance the slides. There we go. Okay. So as with everything, this really started with my parents, Malone and Rhoda Bier. And in terms of what I got from them, one is just a high value on education. And I think almost everybody, if you're listening in this room today, you probably got the same thing from your parents. My parents were also extremely risk averse. So as I grew up, I think I felt like, hey, there must be a better way to deal with these issues rather than such a, just trying to avoid all possible risks. And in some ways, I think I achieved that. In other ways, I learned over time that everybody is irrational in how they deal with risk, just irrational in their own ways. In terms of as a lab scientist, he was very pragmatic, very hands-on. And I think I got from him an intuition for which kinds of problems were doable. I'm not the kind of person that has wanted to spend 10 years banging my head against a problem that I might or might not eventually be able to solve. And, he and I think both had sort of a good eye for problems either that nobody had quite thought of tackling yet, or that we were tackling in a different way that would let us make a concrete contribution. From my mother, I got the love of thinking about abstract ideas. My mother was an artist. She was interested in Oriental religion and philosophy. And so I remember one time early in my career when I was writing a couple of papers that were critiques of fuzzy set theory and trying to explain what I was working on. My dad was almost kind of dismissive and just thought like, oh my gosh, how can you stand to think about such weird abstract ideas? My mom, by contrast, and was excited and saying, oh, this is, there's an idea in Buddhism that's very closely related to that, and shared with me. The quote was from a 2nd century Buddhist philosopher who said that, unlike sort of traditional Western logic, where we think everything is either true or not true, this Buddhist philosopher said it is also possible for things to be both true and not true, or neither true or not true. And so from her, I got that kind of love for thinking about abstract ideas. Other people who had an influence on me during my career, during my undergrad years at Stanford, I had the opportunity to with Ron Howard, who I think is also on the Zoom today, and take decision analysis from him. Those of you on the call who had decision analysis for me got only a poor approximation of what it would be like to study with Ron. One of the things that was most memorable to me about that class, the year that I took it with Ron, there was a large cheating ring, both of whom were applied math majors, were mystified, not that anybody would want to cheat, but that if you were going to cheat, why would you cheat in decision analysis, where the whole concept of the class was so logical and clear and made so much sense? Wouldn't you save your cheating for some place where the content was really difficult and confusing? Another big influence while I was in graduate school at MIT was Ralph that time, but he visited a couple of times to give talks. One of the I remember very vividly, I forget exactly which paper of his he was presenting. I think it was probably one on equity and public risk. And he was talking about how people balanced different goals they might have for risk that seemed to be kind of incompatible or incommensurate. And I remember raising my hand from the back of the seminar room and saying, I'm really confused. I don't get it. It seems like you're comparing apples and oranges. And Ralph said, yes, that's right, Vicki. That's what you that made the concept crystal clear in my mind. I never forgot it after that. Fortunately, Ralph has either forgotten that I ever asked anything so dumb or been kind enough not to give me a hard time about it over the year. After graduate school, I went to work for a consulting company, Pickard in California, where I worked closely with John Garrick, one of the principals of the company, and Stan Kaplan, who was one of the intellectual leaders of the company. We did mainly risk analysis for nuclear power plants, and that's where I really learned Bayesian statistics thoroughly. I had been exposed to it in graduate school, but there's really a difference when you're working with it every day than when you're reading about the theory of it in a journal article. So that was a great experience for 7 years early in my career. Subsequently, soon after leaving PLG, I came to University of Wisconsin. That was a great choice for a couple of reasons. One is just that Madison is a great location and has been a wonderful place to live. There's a reason why I never took an offer from Penn State over the years. But I also really appreciate all the great colleagues I've had in the department, and especially the fact that the department so values interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary and really eclectic work. At Wisconsin, I never felt like I was out of the mainstream. I could always look down the hall and find somebody who was working on some topic that was even more far out from the mainstream than what I was doing. Nobody ever looked at me funny and said, "Why are you working on that, Vicki?" And in fact, even Rajan Suri, who is, very traditional IE for manufacturing type of faculty member early in my career, said, "Oh no, of course you fit right in. You're working on electric power generation. That's just continuous process manufacturing instead of discrete manufacturing." So this was definitely a good place for me to have my career, as you can see from the fact I've been here 30 years and haven't left. The single biggest theme of my work over the years was decisions under uncertainty. And I was especially interested in decisions under extreme uncertainty, and especially in cases where there was probabilistic dependence between the different uncertain events that made the problems more complicated. One of my favorite paper titles, not by me, but from a colleague of mine, is "Learning from Samples of One or Fewer." For example, if you're looking at nuclear power core melts, the plant you're analyzing may never have had a core melt, but you still want to learn as much as you can about how to prevent that. So in my experience, working on problems where the uncertainty is really large, where instead of plus or minus 10%, the uncertainty might be orders of magnitude, first of all, makes rigor more important. If you're working on, do cigarettes cause lung cancer, or how many people die of car accidents in the US, the data is so overwhelming that it pretty much, the question answers itself almost no matter what methodology you would apply. But when you have very sparse data, you really are relying on methodological rigor to get reliable, meaningful answers. However, I think this focus on extreme uncertainty had another advantage, which is it helps sharpen the intuition about when and why uncertainty is important in decision-making. To give some perspective, Di Finetti, who was one of the great probabilists of the 20th century and much, much smarter than I am, I'm sure, had this belief that when dealing with subjective probabilities, it didn't make sense to say that you were uncertain about the probability of something. In his mind, that was kind of like being uncertain about your own favorite color. There was nobody who was going to be a bigger expert than you about what your favorite color is. So you might be indifferent between two different colors, but it didn't make sense to say, "I don't know my favorite color." And likewise, it didn't make sense to Di Finetti to say, "I don't know the probability of that event." I was able to develop a mathematical formalism for why it is reasonable to be uncertain about probabilities and why it might make a difference in practice. In particular, I realized that oftentimes we're really talking about conditional probabilities, and it makes sense that you might be uncertain about the conditions. So for example, if I'm thinking about what the probability is of going for a walk tomorrow, that's going to depend on tomorrow's weather, and I don't yet know that. So I can be uncertain because of that. And so that's some of the work that I'm the proudest of from early in my career. And it's not something that I did, again, by being smarter than DiFinetti. It's something I was able to do because I was working in a situation where the uncertainties were so large that the intuition about why they were important was clear-cut. For most of my career, I've really been working on applied risk topics. So a few photographs here. I worked on nuclear power both early in my career and then again more recently after Fukushima. This is AJ Nosek, a recent PhD student who's on the call, who's working at Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I also worked with Greg Hammond recently, who's in the US Air Force on nuclear power preparedness. Lower left is Susan King, who's a policy analyst and attorney in the US. I worked with her in the aughts on pandemic preparedness, a topic that's obviously coming back now, and am continuing to work with her today on some other things. I had many years of work on terrorism. Of me with Jun Zhuang, who's now at Buffalo, and we did some work on combining terrorism and natural disasters in the model. In thinking about applied work, one of the things I had the opportunity to do was to collaborate with my husband, Dave Glyer, who's an economist, and working on effects of deregulation on safety for nuclear power plants. For those of you who are interested in policy research and is it possible to make an impact with academic research on policy relevant topics, I think the answer is sort of. I eventually heard that people on both sides of the topic about deregulation and people who thought it was a no, never mind, were quoting parts of my report at each other. So no, I didn't have a single recommendation of what to do that was adopted by the agency, but hopefully it was at least influential in helping them understand the issues and get to a better policy. My first doctoral student was Nasser Azayez, who's now teaching in his home country of Tunisia. And we worked on this idea that we called perfect aggregation. And to frame it briefly, if you think about, say, a nuclear power plant, where there are lots of components, component level, how often each pump or valve failed, also data at the system level, how many core melts happened out of how many reactor years of experience. When we first started thinking about this, it was kind of an open question of should you first, on the red path, update the failure rate of each individual component with component level data, and then propagate the posteriors through the risk model to estimate the failure probability for the whole plant. Alternatively, you could go the blue route, propagate the prior distributions for component risk estimate for the plant with plant level or system level data. And we were able to show that at least under the vast majority of conditions, you were better off using the component level data. Essentially, the reason is that if you use system level data, you were throwing away a lot of information. For example, there may be incidents where the system has succeeded, but a number of components have failed. And if you use only the data that the system succeeded, you're throwing away a lot of relevant information. A number of years later, we also had a chance to work together again, co-editing a book on game theory for Homeland Security. Other students, Wu Junyi worked with me, studies of accident precursors. If you don't have very many severe accidents, then you may want to learn from partially relevant data, such as Near's work was, again, using Bayesian methods. But here, this idea of probabilistic dependency turned out to be very important because the occurrence frequencies of accident precursors are correlated with the overall accident probability, but not perfectly correlated. They are what you might think of as partially relevant data, so you have to figure out how to analyze those dependencies. And Wu Jun, who I know is on the call today, is currently running a consulting company in South Korea where he does a lot of work on the safety and reliability of the Korean rail system. Another problem of sparse data was trend detection. I worked on this with if we don't have enough data to even estimate a constant failure rate with a high degree of accuracy, how can we detect and estimate trends to be able to anticipate possible aging trends, deterioration early enough to take action? And that's something that has, again, come back to haunt us this past year in the pandemic, that in order to take effective action, you may need to identify trends very early on, which again can be a problem for Bayesian statistics, how to whether things are getting worse when you don't have enough data for a really definitive answer using classical statistics yet. In policy-related research, I worked on risk-informed regulation. Here, the key uncertainty is that usually the regulated company, such as a nuclear power plant, has a lot more information about their own risks than the regulating agency would have. So the regulator needs to design a policy that can accommodate their own uncertainty about the risks, for example, by creating incentives for companies to come forward and voluntarily disclose some of the risks that they knew about. So that's work that I did with Shiwei Lin, who's currently teaching in Taiwan, and in fact just told me he's now department chair at his department there. A kind of bonus round that Shiwei worked on in addition to his dissertation work on risk-informed regulation was the use of expert opinion as a way to characterize uncertainty. And in particular, he and I did a lot of empirical work using a data set of numerous expert elicitations assembled by Roger Cook from Resources for the Future. And so that was kind of above and beyond the work that he did on his dissertation. Getting on to Homeland Security, both Larry Bank, who was at that time in civil engineering at University of Wisconsin, and Steve Robinson had the foresight to get involved in security-related problems before September 11th and invited me to be involved and said, hey, risk analysis sounds like it should be closely related to Homeland Security. Why don't you come work on these issues with us? And I have to say that at the time when I was first getting involved in those topics, I remember thinking to myself, well, I'm not sure this is the most important thing I could be working on, but it's certainly intellectually interesting. I'll give it a try. Larry and Steve had way more foresight than I did. They knew that it was going to be one of the most important things that people could be working on. In risk analysis, I had already had the benefit of thinking about security for a while by then. And many of my risk analysis colleagues said, oh, security, we do risk analysis. Our usual methods should apply just fine to homeland security problems. And I was one of the few people who early on was saying, no, I don't think so. This feels really different. I don't think we can treat this just as a traditional probabilistic risk analysis challenge. So at the bottom here is one of the early papers that I wrote on this topic with a couple of master's students. And this work was funded by Robinson's grant from the Defense Department at that time. Subsequently, I had the advantage of getting involved in the Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events at the University of Southern California. Detlev von Winterfeld, a decision analyst, was one of the founders of the center. In addition, I got to work closely with a really interesting and diverse and talented group of colleagues. Adam Rowe in economics, Richard John in psychology, Steve Hora and Ali Abbas in decision analysis, Robin Dillon Merrill, who's now at Georgetown University, Elizabeth Pate Cornell at Stanford, Ray Zimmerman at NYU, and a large number of students and other colleagues. I didn't have room for everybody on the slide. One of the first lines of work that we undertook as part of CREATE in my group was extending the initial sort of toy models, like the paper that I did with the master's students on security investment, to problems of more realistic size and complexity. W. Madison. I remember a conversation with him where he said, you have this paper that does this problem with 2 agents. I think I can see how to generalize it to an arbitrary number of agents, at which point I said, sure, you're hired, come to Madison and let's work on that. He also had the insight on how to incorporate terrorism and natural disasters in the same model, in particular by treating natural disasters just as a really dumb terrorist that can't observe and respond to defense. If we protect every building in San Francisco against terrorist attacks, a smart terrorist might decide to target a building in Houston instead. But if we defend every building in San Francisco against earthquakes, the earthquake really cannot just observe that and move to Houston. Another area that Jun worked on in his dissertation was the effects of secrecy and deception to account for attacker uncertainty. The attacker may be uncertain about how valuable certain targets are to the defender, or they may be uncertain about how well defended particular targets are. And so Jun worked on whether there's a way to account for that to make defensive investments more effective and cost effective. And actually, in one of those papers, we had the opportunity to work with O's Algos on the methodology side. Jun was very interested in using dynamic programming as part of his dissertation to show that he could use sort of traditional IE tools and techniques, not just game theory, which is usually thought of more as a branch of economics. And I have to say, I have always really helped you with the method, with the model formulation side, but I cannot help you on the algorithms and computation and methodology side. So fortunately, O's agreed to contribute on that. And so I have a paper co-authored with O's down at the bottom of the slide. A couple of students who worked with me during this time frame on, again, introducing greater realism into the security models. Jamie, who was Jamie Manoyo at the time she was at Madison, and now Jamie Bonarato, is currently working at the Department of Defense. Nara, who also changed last names since she was in the department, is now teaching in Thailand. And they worked with me on better models of target attractiveness, in particular, maximize deaths or only maximize economic damage. Probably they have multiple attributes that they care about, similar to anybody else who is making a decision. They probably have multiple attributes that are important to them. So we worked on that together. She was very interested in the idea of defensive hedging. Like most forms of optimization, game theory often gives so-called bang-bang solutions, extreme solutions that might say, for example, that we should focus all of our resources on, say, preventing smallpox attacks because that's the single most devastating attack strategy. But in the real world, we know that we probably don't want to do that. We probably want intermediate solutions that have some hedging in them and defend against multiple different types of attack strategies. And so her dissertation worked on that topic. Another area of realism, Nara worked with me on a couple of papers dealing with inspection of container freight. And in particular, could we get container freight deterrence of smuggling attempts with less than 100% protection? Less than 100% inspection is, if you want to deter smuggling of something that's cheap, such as AK-47s, well, you probably can't really deter it because those are cheap to replace if they get confiscated. And so if you want to prevent smuggling of that, you really need 100% inspection. But if people are trying to smuggle something that's inherently really valuable, such as a nuclear weapon that they might have spent several years either acquiring or developing, at that point, it may be possible to deter somebody from trying to smuggle that in container freight. Mavis Wang, who's now teaching at Tsinghua University in China, worked with me again on a number of different homeland security problems, of which one of the important ones from her dissertation was being able to better model attacker capability, not just attacker goals or intent. The basic idea there is that in the intelligence world, people spend a lot of time and effort thinking about attacker capability. For example, UAs, as far as things that they care about, which targets would be attractive to them. But if one group is much more capable than another, they might still have different target choices, not because they have different values, but just because the less capable group might be constrained in which targets they could choose or which strategies would be effective for them. Working with John Welborn, who's now at RAND, I got introduced to Kjell Hausken, an economist at University of Stavanger in Norway. And he taught me to think about terrorism more like an economy. My husband, who is an economist, always tells me that economics is not about dollars. It's read with Kjell was looking at what incentives are faced by terrorists, what incentives are faced by defenders, and how can those influence their choices or influence what constitutes a good defensive strategy. I should apologize because I know there are a lot of students and other colleagues who did not get mentioned here. I felt like it was really impossible to do justice to all of the different collaborations in one talk. So I tried to hit some highlights, but if you didn't get, the last colleague that I do want to mention is Rob Goebel, who was in environmental studies at Clark University in Worcester. He's somebody, so Rob Goebel at Clark University encouraged me to think about what words of wisdom I would have for students. So one of them is just that I have found decision analysis to be a very good lens through which to think about hard problems. Thinking about both the uncertainties and the preferences or value judgments was really important. And I think of myself religion. And by that, I don't mean that I'm a religious fanatic and dislike all other methodologies, but more that decision analysis colors the way I view things in the same way that being raised Catholic or Jewish or Hindu also colors the way you see the world. A second piece of advice is that I have found that working on practical problems can be a good way both to identify interesting methodological questions, but also to answer them. So the early work that I talked about of what does it mean to be uncertain about a probability, that's something I was able to answer because I had a people find that they don't reason entirely in math or logic, but that having a context can help them in thinking about problems. So I would encourage at least many of you to find that balance between practical applied work and interesting theoretical or methodological. A third comment is that being widely read is an advantage. If you are working on your classes or your dissertation, try to read more broadly than just the bare minimum you need to work on what you're doing. You really never know when something you might have read 10 or 20 years ago turns out to be relevant to a new problem that comes up. So I've been reading on cognitive psychology and risk perception just on OR. These days with webinars, I'm going to webinars on behavioral economics. For example, and where unfortunately I can't dredge up the things I've read as easily as I used to be able to. I still have kind of a vague recollection that at least I was exposed to the idea somewhere, but even that is helpful. So reading widely in areas that are of general interest to you will probably benefit you at some point, even if it doesn't benefit you immediately. The last small word of wisdom I would share is to think about the biggest weaknesses in your models. This is actually one of the best questions I ever got on a talk. I was presenting to the advice. We're back. Sorry about the interruption. Just wait for the slide to reload.
So Vicki, we had you right when you started, right? I think right at the beginning of this slide, and then we kind of lost you.
Perfect. Okay. So I will just start at the top on the slide, and maybe you can snip this out. So Rob.
Yeah, I'm going to suggest that she call in. I'll send her Jane. If you're on here, can you send her the Zoom call-in number so maybe she can fit
Sure.
and I'll bring up the slides.
Hey,
Yeah.
Jeffrey, can you hear me? This is Adam Rose.
Hi, Adam.
Hey, can you send it to more of us? Some of us sometimes need to move away from our computers. If you could somehow send that out.
Just
appreciate the call-in info.
Sure, I'll put that in the chat in just a moment.
Oh, great.
I have to look it up though here. Hang on.
I'm looking it up too, Jeff.
I've got it here.
Hi,
Okay.
I'm back on.
Do you want, I'm going to put the call-in number in case.
Okay, we can do that, but yeah.
In case you want to do, but we could try one more time, but.
Okay, so text me the call-in number, and then if we do get interrupted again, we'll be able to go from there.
Jeff, if you send it in an email, people will be able to
Okay.
click it in their smartphone.
So, Rob Goebel at Clark University encouraged me to think about what words of wisdom I would have for students. So one of them is just that I have found decision analysis to be a very good lens through which to think about hard problems. Thinking about both the uncertainties and the preferences or value judgments was really important. And I think of myself religion. And by that, I don't mean that I'm a religious fanatic and dislike all other methodologies, but more that decision analysis colors the way I view things in the same way that being raised Catholic or Jewish or Hindu also colors the way you see the world. A second piece of advice is that I have found that working on practical problems can be a good way both to identify interesting methodological questions, but also to answer them. So the early work that I talked about of what does it mean to be uncertain about a probability, that's something I was able to answer because I had people find that they don't reason entirely in math or logic, but that having a context can help them in thinking about problems. So I would encourage at least many of you to find that balance between practical applied work and interesting theoretical or methodological. A third comment is that being widely read is an advantage. If you are working on your classes or your dissertation, try to read more broadly than just the bare minimum you need to work on what you're doing. You really never know when something you might have read 10 or 20 years ago turns out to be relevant to a new problem that comes up. So I've been reading on cognitive psychology and risk perception, just on OR. These days with webinars, I'm going to webinars on behavioral economics. For example, and in where unfortunately I can't dredge up the things I've read as easily as I used to be able to. I still have kind of a vague recollection that at least I was exposed to the idea somewhere, but even that is helpful. So reading widely in areas that are of general interest to you will probably benefit you at some point, even if it doesn't benefit you immediately. The last small word of wisdom I would share is to think about the biggest weaknesses in your models. This is actually one of the best questions I ever got on a talk. I was presenting to the advisory board at Create, and one of the people on the board who was more on the practice side said, you know, what are the biggest weaknesses in your model needs to be done. And obviously that's important in coming up with your next step in your research agenda, but it also actually helps defend your work in a strange way. I think students sometimes feel like the best way to defend their work is to overstate it, to claim that it solves all possible problems and is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And that actually makes your work easier to attack because people only need to find one tiny weakness and, gee, you didn't admit to that weakness, now they have a criticism. If you can instead find your own weaknesses and be thinking about your own weaknesses, then when you present your, or I still think it's a good method despite these weaknesses for the following reasons, and that makes your work much more difficult to. In terms of what comes next, first of all, I'm hoping to have more time for fun things, cross-country skiing, or when there is travel again, more travel after the pandemic winds down. But I also currently have 3 projects either underway or in the incipient stages. One that I'm working on with Paul Cantor, who's on the call, and also Jerry Zhu and computer science and Gary Lupian in psychology, is on understanding the relative strengths and weaknesses of human and machine learning. I also have a project with one of our graduate students, Yuchun Zhou, my last doctoral student, and one of our undergrads, Tikam Porn, on using agent-based modeling to explore relocation in anticipation of coastal flooding. Can we provide subsidies that encourage people to move out of the most at-risk areas prior to major flood damage? And finally, together with a couple of Create colleagues, I have a project that's currently under review at NSF on pandemic risk management and whether we can help people become better at managing pandemic decisions by simulating experience by various types of feedback, etc. So as Jeff mentioned at the beginning, I do hope to still be involved in research in the next few years, and maybe even physically around the department at some point after the pandemic winds down. So I think with that, I will stop sharing and be happy. I will try turning my video on, but not sure how well that will work.
Well, thank you very much, Vicki, for a great talk. The audio was out just a little bit, but I still think it was a fabulous talk and everybody got a lot out of it. We have about 9 or 10 minutes for questions for the first part of this session. I'll try to moderate this until about 1 o'clock, and then I have another commitment and I'll turn it over to my colleague. But does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask our colleague, Professor Bier? Let's see, it's hard to see if people's hands are up. There's too many people.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to have to just speak up if you'd like to ask a question.
Vicki, this is Richard John. Do you want to comment on anything that you learned being department chair? That's an activity you didn't mention, which one could interpret that in many ways. So I thought maybe we would ask if you had any comments or any advice to people who might be considering that that job.
I missed the first half of your question, unfortunately.
Oh, it has to do with being department chair. Do you have any comments or thoughts about that experience?
Yeah, I actually quite liked it. It's dangerous for your research productivity for sure. I recently saw somebody on Twitter commenting that Twitter is the perfect complement to a department chair job because you can do it in 45-second bursts. Hard to do research that way. But yes, I found it rewarding. It was a completely different set of things to think about other than just equations and math. So I wouldn't discourage people from doing it. I'm happy to provide words of wisdom for anybody who may find themselves considering that.
Vicki, this is Paul.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have any thoughts to share about what it's like trying to get the government to actually do something that they paid you to figure out how to do.
Well, like I said, I have not been too successful at that. Realistically, a lot of my work, it's been more background work. But I would say it has not been super successful. Actually, a number of years ago on Homeland Security, it was something that I describe as the put up or shut up DHS, where they were saying, everybody keeps telling us to use game theory, show us how to do it. And they had a 2-year funding mechanism that was supposed to demonstrate how. We were by far, I think, the strongest team in the first round, which was 9 months long. And they never funded the second.
Yeah.
Round. So
I lose it, yeah. Are you still there, Vicki?
yeah.
Okay, yeah, we lost you just at the end
Oh,
there.
sorry.
Any other questions? Other additional questions for Vicki in the first part of our session here? I guess I'll just sort of add a comment. I think Vicki's being too modest about her time as department chair. She accomplished a lot to move the department forward, including some great hires. But like I said, at her retirement as well, I think what, at the time I was just a lowly professor, what we appreciated even more about about Vicki's accomplishments wasn't the accomplishments themselves, but the way in which she accomplished them. She focused on transparency in all her decision-making processes. She followed shared governance and worked to make sure that every faculty member's voice was heard. So I think she was really integral to keeping our department's very collegial atmosphere alive. So and that I think hopefully continues to this day, and we have her in significant part to thank for that.
Well,
Hi,
the
Jeff.
other word of wisdom I would share about being chair is that you really cannot assess your accomplishments on a year-by-year basis. Every year when I had to write my annual report to the dean, I felt like I had accomplished absolutely nothing. And only when at
Lost again.
the end of 5.5 years, I got to think back. Any other questions or comments?
I think Mehmet
I
wanted to
have-
say something. Yeah, go ahead, Mehmet.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Hi, Vicki again. You talk about your career in a nutshell with the milestones. I really enjoyed that, and it was, an interesting lesson for me. But I want to maybe hear about your personal decision makings, especially in your professional life. So, how did you handle your personal decision makings, especially when you change your career from industry to, academia, or maybe changing your topics slightly from one area to another? Could you give us a little bit, maybe your experience share?
Well, I think I had the
I think for Vicki, for our
advantage
department's
to come up at
graduation
a
gift to you,
time
we're going to
when
buy
it
you a
was not
T1 line.
necessary.
So you're going to have to start over, Vicki.
Yeah, I cannot hear you,
Try-
Vicki.
Some advice is too important to be shared on the internet.
Speaks to the importance of decision-making and choosing an internet provider.
Yeah. She lives in a nice neighborhood too, so it's not like she's
Right.
way out in the country.
No, I'm just on to Mehmet's question. There's actually a very funny story. One of the places that I interviewed when I was looking for academic jobs was Harvard Business School. And they never gave me an offer, but I made it to the interview stage at least. And it was quite funny because I was just getting over a breakup in my personal life at the time of the interview. And when I met with their dean, he had 2 questions, one of which was like, where do you see yourself 5 or 10 years from now? To which the answer is like, I'm trying to figure out if I can make myself eat tomorrow. I wasn't really very well prepared to answer long range questions. And the other one he had, I was, I think 35 at the time. He said, why are you changing careers at your age? Quite say it that way, but that was kind of implied. And again, I didn't really have a good answer, but somebody many years later told me I should have told him that I wanted to change careers while I was still young. So I don't think I have any great lessons on career planning other than just things were.
That's the answer I gave
out
when
in
I
the long run.
interviewed it.
The other IM who maybe had different opportunities, different areas of focus that didn't turn out to be as popular or whatever. So it's not all talent, but. So.
Well, I guess we're at the end of at least the first hour. I know that the next hour, some students, Vicki's former students and some of our ISyE students are going to stick around and get to ask Vicki some more questions and maybe just do some catching up and talk about the old times of research and what the new directions everyone's working on are. But for those of you who came to the colloquium, I really thank you for that and that you were able to be here with us to share a great career, a great continuing career of our colleague. So one more time, it's hard to really cheer and it's hard to give hugs. I would give you a huge hug, Vicki, if I were there. But if we could do this in person, we'll save it for maybe April, May, or June when we can all be together
Okay.
again. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So some of you